they say that neither the policy of reservation can be enforced by the state nor any quota or percentage of admissions be carved out or appropriated by the state in minority or minority educational institutions. In other words, if you do not receive aid, you cannot be subject to the reservation or quota policy of the state. If you receive aid, then you can dilute the protection of Article 31. This was the essential spirit of Inamdar case. Then they go on to same thing on admission procedure. They state that the admission procedure can be regulated, but it must meet, as long as it meets the requirement of fair, transparent and non-exploitative, they are free to set their own procedure. Only if it doesn't fail to meet the requirement of fair, transparent and non-exploitative can the state set it aside. So there is an enormous burden on the state to set aside the admission procedure of institution, unaided institution. The third is regulation of fees. And here I quote, to set up a reasonable fee structure is also a component of the right to establish and administer an institution within the meaning of Article 31. Every institution is free to devise its own fee structure, subject to the limitation that there can be no profiteering and no capitation fee can be charged directly or in any form. Now, the judgment is extremely clear, it is succinct, it's a short judgment and it spells this out. The spirit of the TMFI judgment is that regulations under Article 19(6) should not be of a character so as to eliminate or to make the rest of Article 19 irrelevant. You cannot, by the rubric of reservation, eliminate the fundamental freedom guaranteed in Article 19. Now, having said this, if you read both the newspapers at the center and the states in Delhi and anywhere else, listen to the acts of the judiciary, both at the High Court level, sometimes in Supreme Court, and also legislatures, you find that there is a great unwillingness to understand this judgment. And I'll give you an example which is currently happening in the city of Delhi, and I think in cities all over the country. Private schools need to revise their fees in light of the decisions of the 6th Pay Commission so that teachers' salaries have been changed. There is a huge resistance to allow them to change their fees. Notice that fees is not an issue in government schools because there is a separation between fees and the amount of money they receive for support. In private schools, fees is the principal measure by which schools receive money for support. All sorts of ad hoc solutions are being proposed. And the point is, all of them are illegitimate in terms of this judgment. The principle of the judgment is that the school is free to charge fees provided it is not profiteering or charging capitation fees. What you need to set up is a transparent and fair mechanism of accounting and verifying on those accounting reports. You do not have the right to set fees. Delhi administration will say we will allow you to raise fees by 500 rupees if you are this, 250 rupees if you are this. That is meaningless. Because even if one school can demonstrate from its accounts that this was what it was earning today and this is how much more it needs today, it is perfectly within its requirements to get it. And yet the Delhi High Court has been entertaining a PIL for the last year on this matter. So lack of understanding of the notion of separation and the constitutional requirement of Article 19 is very deep. I will now turn to a second area of concern, and that relates to confusing statements about activism. I myself am guilty of the same, so to some extent, because I wrote a paper on judicial activism, and this section actually seeks to pull myself back from what I stated in that paper. I defined activism, or we defined activism in that paper by appealing to the functional principles of separation of powers and then saying that when there is overreach, that is an institution which has authority in one functional area, extends itself to making decisions in another functional area, we call it activism. Another way of thinking about this is conflation, that you merge the rights of or actions in two institutions in a synergistic manner. This happens for a variety of reasons. The case of environmental issues illustrates some of these concerns. The story on environment is as follows. The major event shaping legal attitudes to environment is the Bhopal gas tragedy. The immediate response was to seek a remedy in US courts as they had a well-developed system of tort liability. However, in 1986, the New York courts dismissed the case on the ground of this not being the right forum. The matter shifted to the Indian courts. However, the legal response to Bhopal was poor. I don't want to get into the details of what happened in Bhopal, but there was a sense in the legal and judicial community that we failed. This was an opportunity for us to show how the law would work, and we did not fail. The consequences of that failure are presented today, in that Bhopal is a problem which has not been adequately addressed. But as a consequence, it laid the ground for a number of public interest litigations in environmental matters, and the court became a lot more sensitive to handling environmental cases. This they did by moderating the ancient requirement of locus standi for access to judicial remedies. Secondly, by reinterpreting the constitution to expand the scope and content of various fundamental rights. Thus, in Francis Mullin versus the Administrative Union Territory of Delhi, Justice Bhagwati, speaking for the court, stated that a constitutional provision must be construed not in a narrow and constricted sense, but in a wide and liberal manner so as to anticipate and take account of changing conditions and purposes, so that the constitutional provision does not get atrophied or fossilized. This was to play a major role as the court was to read the right to clean air and water into the right to life. Thus we see in Subhash Kumar versus the state of Bihar, right to life is a fundamental right under Article 21 and so on. So, in a series of PILs, the court tried to find innovative ways to address the vacuum which had been created in environmental matters, a vacuum which was demonstrated by the failure which occurred in Bhopal, through suitable definitions in the structure of rights. In 1985, concerned with Delhi's growing pollution problem, MC Mehta filed a writ petition to direct the Delhi government to implement the Air Act. This petition led to a series of inquiries by the court on what was being done on this problem. In the early stages of the litigation, the impact was primarily to push the executive into formulating measures for pollution control. These measures were ineffective due to poor implementation. The poor progress pushed the court into pushing the administration into creating an authority, now called the Borila Committee, to monitor progress and implementation. The authority was further assisted by the court in that a number of its decisions were made into court orders, so that non-implementation opened the gate for a charge of contempt. This solution was not unique, since in many long-running PILs on forests, the right to food, etc., similar committees or executive offices were created by the court, either through the office of amicus curiae or by establishing a committee provided for in the law, and directing, giving support to its work. This has been a novel experiment of amalgamation of judicial and executive authority. The legal instrument for implementing this is the concept of continuing mandamus. Under this system, the executive reports compliance with court orders and seeks further orders based on implementation experience. The environmental benefits of this experiment are indisputable. Evidence of Delhi air pollution and forest cover have shown significant improvements, or at least a reversal of trend. The problems are more in the realm of separation of powers, especially insofar as they relate to the authority of the legislature or the problem of democratic control. Now, the constitution framers did not visualize a strict separation of powers, but they envisaged a system of checks and balances. Now, in part, the amalgamation of the legislature with the executive vitiated some of these checks. And the court is now seeking to compensate for that vitiation by strengthening the executive through the use of judicial authority. Now, I can see that as a natural response to a problem, but we need to go back and understand why did that vitiation take place in the first place. Again, if you go back, you'll find it rooted in the 42nd Amendment. The problem of this judicial decision making is not a substitute for effective policy. To illustrate, the vehicle pollution case is focused on Delhi, following on the example of the Supreme Court and some high courts in metros. But air pollution, in fact, and other forms of pollution are of nationwide concern. And in the absence of a policy to the approach, the court solutions are merely palliatives which don't directly address the principal problem. Similarly, the Right to Food campaign has focused on ICDS in general and food in particular, but the requirements of balanced development require a critical assessment of schemes and institutions. This may require trade-offs across schemes and beneficiary groups. The court or its committees are not equipped for assessing such trade-offs. Further, the involvement of activists in different court committees exacerbates the problem because activists tend to push the single agenda which they are looking. The principal advantage of the legislature was that they are equipped to deal with such contestation of rights. There is an example of such a conflict looming between the activists in the forest case and those advocating tribal rights. We will have the regulatory authority and an appellate tribunal. Ostensibly, this is part of a general trend encouraged because the civil courts are overwhelmingly flawed, so it is felt that a special court or tribunal will speed up the required justice. The fragmentation of the court system might speed up some cases, but surely leads to inefficiencies that are generated by ambiguous jurisdictions. The key problem with such fragmentation is it inhibits the development of a unified legal doctrine. Let me consider a particular problem. Consider the problem of interconnection in telecom. Telecom as a network industry suffers from the possibility of market failure because a dominant firm, by limiting access to its network, can vitiate or limit the benefits of competition. TRAI has attempted to perform its duty as a regulator by setting port charges as well as access deficit charges. Moves that have been contested by challenging the legal legitimacy of TRAI to make these decisions. Such challenges imply that interconnected issues are often under perpetual litigation. TRAI was recently obliged to approach the Supreme Court to clarify an order passed by TDSAT that said that TRAI had no adjudicatory powers to resolve interconnection disputes. The TDSAT passed the order in response to a petition by BSNL challenging a directive issued by TRAI. The tribunal said, when TRAI has no adjudicatory function under this act, it cannot in turn takes the stand that it has powers to pass interim orders in dispute between two operators. If TRAI has no powers to pass final orders, it cannot have powers to pass interim orders. In return, TRAI contended it had the power to frame regulations for interconnections. It also had the power, therefore, to settle disputes with regard to such matters. This matter went up to the Supreme Court, which did not clarify the jurisdictional issue, but stayed the TDSAT order, in effect, solved the problem for now and said we'll worry about the larger issues later, and extended interconnectivity facilities enjoyed by BSNL consumers to consumers of all service providers. There are many examples. I was just doing a cursory look at Supreme Court rulings on various appellate tribunals, and one of the things which comes out is the appellate tribunals have been pulled back number of times for overreach. They have set aside the regulator's orders and the court has said, wait a minute, you can't go this far. Your job as an appellate tribunal is not to go into some of these issues. And you've not read the act carefully. So, one problem is that when you create multiplicity of authority, you also create this problem of conflict. The second problem is a much more fundamental problem. And it is with this I want to close. There is a case which was decided by the High Court of Madras in a matter relating to the setting up of a company law tribunal. The court, Madras High Court, noted that this tribunal would take over a number of decision powers which were formerly with the High Court, and therefore hand over to a body which was set up by the executive powers which were under the judiciary. And this, they said, in short, violates the principle of separation of powers. The centre appealed this judgment. The three-judge bench of the Supreme Court, headed by the Chief Justice, referred the matter to a constitution bench. In specific, they noted that this is a complex matter and it particularly needs us to re-examine the entire law relating to tribunals afresh. Now, let me end by talking about what is this law relating to tribunals which the Supreme Court is talking about. In 1989, a committee headed by Justice Malimat studied the working of tribunals as part of a general study of the court system. There were tribunals from before the regulators came up. We had tribunals for labour, for vote control, for income tax, various issues. And Justice Malimat noted several tribunals are functioning in the country. Not all of them, however, have inspired confidence in the public mind. The reasons are not far to seek. The foremost is lack of competence, objectivity and judicial approach. The next is their constitution, the power and method of appointment of personnel, the inferior status, the casual method of working, etc. etc. Men of caliber are not willing to be appointed as presiding officers in view of the uncertainty of tenure, unsatisfactory conditions of service, executive subordination in matters of administration, and political interference in judicial functions. For these and other reasons, the quality of justice is stated to have suffered, and the cause of expedition is not found to have been served by the establishment of such tribunals. If you were to examine the case subsequently to the establishment of regulators and their appellate tribunals, you would add more reasons to this list. These reasons have not entirely disappeared. The Malimat committee then recommended that instead of instituting tribunals, changes be carried out within the High Court themselves, and there is a way in which this can be done. I won't spell out all the details. Chandra Kumar went through the Malimat report, noted it, observed that this was true, but felt it would be too difficult to get rid of tribunals. So they compromised. They said tribunals will stay, and they gave a number of guidelines for their effective regulation. Those guidelines have remained on paper, they have not been followed. Now, it's Chandrakumar was since then. Any number of tribunals have been set up after that. Now, the court feels that we need to take a fresh look at this. It's important for us to re-look at that original assumption and ask, is the current framework necessary? We should go back and realize that the doctrine of separation of powers is a very powerful doctrine. If you treat it with respect, it gives effective solutions, and there are numerous examples to countries whose legal regime we pay due homage to, both England and the US. Both of them, insofar as economic governance is concerned, has a unified system of judicial. It is time for us to now reconsider this approach to applying a bandage where the problem is and not worrying about the larger problem where it occurs. With this, I will stop. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for sharing valuable information on the institutional aspects of regulation and also for throwing light on how important it is for us to understand how to structure regulation. I now request Justice M. Jagannatha Rao to deliver the presidential address.
Professor Ada, Dr. Mishra, distinguished invited. Subject of today's discussion
quite on the powers of the regulatory authorities, the scope of public interpretation, doctrine of separation of powers, digital activism, etc. As far as regulation is concerned, we have a large number of regulators in our country dealing with different aspects of regulation. On the economic side, we have the Reserve Bank of India, which is the biggest regulator of our economic system, the banking system, our foreign trade, and so on. Then we have the SEBI, which is a regulator of the share market and the exchanges. Now recently we have other regulators for telecom, the TRAI and the TRAI Appellate Authority, DSAT, and that's how it came to be. Then you have even for the SEBI, you have a separate appellate authority today. Then you have the insurance regulator, the IRDA. Then in the field of execution and professionals, you have the UGC, the AICTE, the Bar Council, the Medical Council, and the Institute of Chartered Accountants, and so on. They regulate legal education. They also regulate the professionals, including their qualifications for practice and disciplinary action. There are a number of other regulators doing a lot of regulatory work. As pointed out by Professor Haran,